We've gotten to a point in the camera industry where I think it's less and less important to focus on the specs and more important to focus on the feel. And what do I mean by that? I would equate it to cars, actually. Cars come in all shapes, sizes, makes, models, and everything in between. And I think cameras are actually becoming a lot like cars. But before we get started, like this video, hit the subscribe button and consider joining the channel. Channel members get exclusive access to Filmmaker Alchemy, behind-the-scenes lessons and insights on the business of video production. Learn how to turn your content into gold. Now, when it comes to cars, of course, you have your gearheads, the people who are obsessed with all the numbers, the facts, the figures, the horsepower, the fuel economy. They know all the ins and outs of these engines, of these vehicles, how they run, how they operate. And to be honest, we're probably the same way about cameras, about lenses. We do really obsess over facts and figures and specs. But as time has gone on, if I compare it to the industry 10 or 20 years ago, specs mattered a whole lot more back then compared to how they are now, where for the most part, the camera companies, the sensors, the lenses, they're all kind of interchangeable for the most part. We've kind of evened the playing field, or rather I should say they've evened the playing field with each other. You could argue about 8K versus 6K versus 4K, or 12-bit versus 14-bit versus 16-bit, or 24-bit audio, 32-bit audio. But for the most part, we all have the same stuff that whether you're shooting Canon, Nikon, Sony, Lumix, Blackmagic, whatever, it doesn't really matter. Most of them have some sort of phase hybrid autofocus. Most of them are doing 10-bit color, 422 color sampling, maybe 420 in certain situations. Almost every camera nowadays with a hybrid comes with some kind of log profile, where that used to be the hang up. Certain cameras would have log, other cameras would have light log or no log or a different log. Nowadays, they're more or less all the same. The photos, yeah, we could argue over megapixels, 25 megapixels versus 45 versus 50 versus 60, but they're all really high. Not like back in the day when we had like 2 megapixels versus 4 versus 8, or, just the absurdity of how quickly the megapixel wars took off. And 12 megapixels, oh my gosh, can you imagine? And now we're well beyond that. In fact, some people are arguing we should have less megapixels for better low light performance or sensitivity, or whatever you want to say. So I think it's becoming more and more evident to me that it's less and less about these specs, the stuff that you put on the feature list, the things that it can do over other companies. Because, like I said, they're all more or less kind of the same. And that's where it really comes down to the feel of it, and why I would equate it to cars. Because cars are one of those great things you get to go test drive if you want. You can get on the road, get the wheel in your hands, and drive the thing before you buy it to really understand, does this feel right to me? Do I like how it accelerates? Do I like where the buttons are? When I want to put my blinker on, is it in the right spot? When I want to check my mirrors, how do those look and feel? How does the seat function? What is the feel of driving this vehicle? And for different people, it might matter differently. Maybe it's a work vehicle and you don't really care, or it's a work vehicle and you really do care. Maybe it's just a personal vehicle to get you from point A to point B. Maybe you like the aesthetics on the outside. Maybe you like the aesthetics on the inside. Doesn't really matter, but everyone has their own individual subjective preference. And a lot of it you can customize too, which I would like to see more of in the camera industry. Just more ability to customize the device to your needs versus my needs to someone else's. And we can kind of do that with rigging these things out and kitting them up and adding all the accessories to build it exactly how we like. But still, from the manufacturer, there's not really all that many options when you compare it to cars, where you can get different packages, the LX versus the SX versus the RX, whatever. What size wheels do you want, all that. We can't really customize cameras in the same way, and maybe we'll get there eventually, but it's also not quite the same size market either. So we got to be realistic. But I do think this is good to think about when we think about, do you like to shoot Sony or Nikon or Canon or Lumix or Blackmagic or Fuji or whatever, Hasselblad maybe. Maybe you like to shoot on your iPhone. I don't know. But a lot of it, I think, comes down to that feel of how it operates in the hand, how the user is experiencing the device. How does that tool, like imagine going to Home Depot and buying a tool off the shelf. How does it operate? What are the features? What are the specs? Yes, but then does it get the job done in a way that you expect, a way that is predictable, a way that's intuitive? A lot of times I'm using cameras and I'm wondering, why did they lay the buttons out this way? Or why did they choose to do this goofy thing with the menu? This doesn't seem intuitive at all. And I wonder how much thought goes into that versus trade-offs from other departments within the same company. Maybe they couldn't do it a certain way because, that just didn't make sense for the internal components or whatever the restriction might be. So it is kind of nice to have the options that we have in a landscape where more or less they're all kind of doing the same thing. I think that's a luxury. That's a benefit. You're not forced to buy any of these because they're all really good. And for as much as we argue about one camera being better than another, it always goes back to personal preference and that subjective experience of just using the camera. What does it feel like? My preference for the longest time has been the Lumix cameras just because I like how they feel. Yes, there was a point where the features were cutting edge. They were groundbreaking. We were getting 4K in a mirrorless hybrid before we could even thought that was a reasonable thing to ask for. We got 4K in the GH4. Crazy. And then obviously with some incredible advancements in the GH5, 4K 60, great IBIS. We even got Vlog, but it was Vlog L back then. We did get it, but not my favorite thing. But the times have gone on and more or less everything's even now. And I still like the Lumix cameras. They feel the best to me. They're the most intuitive. They're the easiest to use for me. But that's not to say that they're right for you. Maybe something else resonates with you more. Maybe you like the way the Canon buttons are laid out or the Sony buttons or the Nikon, the way it feels in your hand. And I think that's good. I think everyone should be able to embrace their own preference and shoot with what feels the best to them. But it is my recommendation to these companies to emphasize that part of the marketing, of the messaging. Yes, we love the specs. Keep them coming. We're all desperate for higher numbers at a certain point. It scratches an internal primordial itch, I think, that we all have biologically as humans. The bigger numbers are better. But at the same time, I think it would be smart for these companies to also focus on what is it like to use and operate them? How does it feel to use these devices? And what are they doing special in that regard? What considerations are they applying to their design, to their products that emphasizes usability? Because for me, that's what I come back to. Even if a camera is under-spec'd slightly compared to another one, if it feels better, is more intuitive, and it's more practical, faster, more efficient to use it, I will always choose that one just because in my mind, that's what makes it better, even if the number isn't the exact same. If you were to compare 45 megapixels to 40 megapixels, well, if the 45 megapixel camera is kind of clunky and awkward to use, well, obviously, and the 40 megapixel one is smooth and easy to use, then yeah, I'm going to go with that one. Those 5 megapixels, I don't really care about. Honestly, at the end of the day, a one stop difference in dynamic range or half a stop difference in dynamic range isn't a deal breaker for me. It used to be significantly more valuable when we were dealing with like 8 stops of dynamic range and then 10 and then 12 and upwards from there. But now it's kind of diminishing returns. There's not a lot of wow factor in saying we're 0.5 more dynamic range. Okay, but what's it like to use the thing? Have you considered that? What does it feel like? Are the buttons in the right spot? Is the menu easy to navigate? Is it fun to drive it like a car? A lot of cars are really fun to drive, even though they might not be the best on paper. What is that feeling? What's that experience like? And I hope it's something these camera companies can put more thought into, more mindfulness. Of course, there's always people behind the scenes making these decisions, and they're putting a lot of thought into it, I'm sure. But think about it from a marketing standpoint. How can you communicate all that thought, that design, that intention that it conveys across that finish line to the end customer? Because if we keep getting specs and they're all more or less the same, and we're trying to compare this rolling shutter to that rolling shutter, this dynamic range to that dynamic, this resolution versus that dynamic, this is downsampled, this is pixel bin, this is line skipped. Yes, there's some value there. I do like to geek out over that stuff. But I also like to use these cameras. I like to use these tools, and I like to do my job as effortlessly as possible. And the more they can focus on that and make these cameras fun and interesting and easy to use, faster, snappier. What's it like to go through the menu? What's it like to change the aperture? What's it like to set the white balance? thinking through all those things and making that best user experience. What is the menu even? What does it look like? Is it fun to look at? It's another consideration at play. There's so much more to these cameras than just the specs. And I want to see an industry where we can talk about both things equally. How it looks, what it does, and how it feels.